Welcome to ¿Qué pasa? HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness. Saludos HSI familia, and welcome back to ¿Qué pasa? HSIs. Today we are talking to Dr. Mike Hoa Nguyen, who is an assistant professor of education at New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, and a faculty affiliate at the Asian Pacific American Institute and the Steinhardt Institute for Higher Education Policy. His research and teaching critically examine the benefits and consequences of racialized public policy instruments in expanding and or constraining educational systems. He is the principal investigator of the Minority Serving Institutions Data Project, a research and resource initiative with the mission to advance a greater understanding of MSIs and their unique contributions to post-secondary education. An extension of this work explores Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions, or AANAPISIs, and their role in building capacity to serve Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, or AANHPI, students, staff, faculty, and administrators. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Nguyen has extensive professional experience in the federal government, having served as a senior staff member in the United States Congress. Before federal service, Dr. Nguyen was a program associate at Anza College, where he mentored students, developed a new curriculum, and lectured. He completed his undergraduate studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and his graduate education at the University of California, Los Angeles. Go Bears, go Bruins. He is the proud son of Vietnamese American refugees. I'm geeked out to be learning today with Dr. Mike Nguyen. Dr. Mike Hoa Nguyen, thank you for joining us on ¿Qué pasa? HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. And today, with you as our guest, we're going to be talking about all things MSIs and AANAPISIs. Let's go ahead and start and just hear about your servingness journey.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me, Gina. Huge fan in so many dimensions. So a real honor and a real treat to be joining you today. So thank you for asking about that. You know, my sort of connection to servingness and to MSIs, all of that really stems from my experience as a student, but really after graduating from undergrad at your institution, UC Berkeley. My first job was at a community college in California that at the time wasn't an AANAPISI because the designation didn't exist yet, but eventually became one a little bit after I left working there. But what I think fondly about that time, because despite the fact that the federal designation didn't even exist at that time that I was working there, the way they thought about supporting students, building programs and initiatives, academic co-curricular, all that stuff was really all the ways that you would define servingness. And so I would say the journey really sort of began there in exploring it as a staff member who worked at that institution, and then later on working for the federal government for a member of Congress, Congressman Mike Honda, who spearheaded a lot of the work in order to help establish, in coalition with other members of Congress, to help design and build the AANAPISI designation. So the servingness journey really begins for me through those experiences.
Awesome. Thank you for telling us that. And I love to hear that you have the federal experience. I know we're going to talk about that because that's such an important piece to understanding HSI and AANAPISI in general, because it's a federal construct. And so understanding even that part of it, I think is really cool. So I'm excited to learn more about that throughout our conversation. But I want to talk to you first about some of the research you've done. You've done research, pretty extensive amount of research around Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, or AANAPISIs. And so let's start there. Can you just start by defining AANAPISI, particularly for our listeners, as you think about our listeners that log in to hear about HSI? AANAPISI is similar but different. So if you could just define AANAPISIs for us to start. And then if you want to tell us anything about like maybe where they're located, how many they are, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. And so Yeah, AANAPISIs are really similar to HSIs as a federal construct, as a federal designation, right? Similarly established through an act of Congress, meaning it was legislation that was introduced and it was passed and signed into law by the president. And it's similar in that there's a from a federal perspective, there's an enrollment requirement, right? And so for AANAPISIs, you would the institution needs to have a 10% undergraduate enrollment that identifies as Asian American and or Pacific Islander, as well as, of course, meeting all the federal requirements that are sort of detailed in Section 312B of the Higher Education Act. But really, at the end of the day, that the federal statute is really similar for AANAPISIs as it is for HSIs, and so I think other scholars have called it sort of this classification of MSIs as enrollment-based MSIs, right? MSIs that are there's an enrollment requirement, and so for AANAPISis, it's 10% Asian American Pacific Islander. They're located across the country, and of course, just about every school, if not all the schools in the Pacific, so in the Northern Marianas, in Guam, in Palau, in Hawaii, many of those institutions would be AANAPISis, and then in the mainland, exactly where you would see large concentrations of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Many in California, a lot in the East Coast, particularly in the Northeast and in the sort of DC metro area, the DMV. And then we're beginning to see a large growth in the Midwest, given the large growth of Asian American Pacific Islander populations in that area, as well as pockets in the Pacific Northwest. And then increasingly, now I think we're going to begin to see a growth in the South, particularly in places like Georgia.
Yes. So similar to HSIs, it's where the people are,
That's
where the
right. Yeah.
folks are.
Yeah.
That's where we're gonna see them,
Yeah,
right?
and there's
That's not
about
that hard.
200 of them, I think. So, yeah, not I think, I know there's about 200 of them across the US and in the Pacific. So, what we've seen over time, over the last 10 years or 15 years, is really steady growth in numbers. And so it's a really exciting, I think, time to be doing AANAPISI research and working at an AANAPISI.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving us the number. I like to think about the number. I don't like to compare HSIs or NSIs to HBCUs. Although, because as you know, their HBCUs are much more historical.
Yeah,
They're different, right? But then when I think about the number of HBCUs, there are fewer, right, than both HSIs and ANAPISIs. I give people that just to help people think, okay, you probably know a lot about HBCUs and you probably don't know a lot about ANAPISIs and HSIs, yet there are 200 ANAPISIs and over 500 HSIs. I mean,
yeah,
it's a lot, in comparison to a little less than 100 HBCUs. All important, all important in the MSI landscape, obviously. But yeah, so thank you for just giving us that sort of like definition, so we can
yeah.
ground folks, particularly those that haven't thought much about ANAPISI.
Hmm.
So, from your research, what do we know empirically at this time about ANAPISIs? What has been explored, and maybe what hasn't been explored yet?
Yeah, so I will say the AANAPISis were established, by Congress in 2007, and so they're really not they haven't been around that long, right? That's about 16 years. So so if they've been around as a federal designation for 16 years, there isn't a whole lot of research about AANAPISis at this moment. A lot of that work early on was done by Robert Teranishi, and now there's and he's still doing a lot of that work. And now there's a lot of his advisees and people of that cohort, including me, are branching off and investigating all things about AANAPISis in a lot of different dimensions. And so, so while we know a little bit, right, we know a little bit about the student experience, we know a little bit about racialized experiences on campus. We're beginning to know a little bit about how AANAPISis can be a mechanism to support staff and faculty who identify as AA and HPI. We know a little bit about all these things, but not a lot yet, right? There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. But I think some of the really stuff that tends to interest policymakers, folks that I spend a little bit of time with, is that there's beginning to be both quantitative and qualitative research that is beginning to demonstrate how these institutions are really serving their students and the benefits that you're seeing from that. From some of the quantitative stuff, like students are more likely to transfer from a community college to a university, more likely to take more credits while they're in school, more likely to graduate, to qualitative work that shows that through this designation and being an AANAPISI, students are more engaged on campus, more engaged in their communities, finding connection in their curriculum to their own lived experiences. So a host of really wonderful outcomes and benefits. But that's again just the tip of the iceberg, I think. And there's a lot of wonderful emerging scholars out there that are pushing the limits and beginning to explore this in all new dimensions. And I get so excited when I get to read that work.
Yes, exciting. And thank you for honoring the folks who start doing some of this work, like Rob Teranishi. Shout out to Rob for doing a
Yeah,
lot of really important NPZ and HSI, MSI in general
yeah.
work. So it's good to make sure we honor, right, the work that has come before us. So one thing you mentioned was like curriculum, right? Like students seeing themselves in the curriculum. Is there anything else that you would say you would suggest works, right, for AA and NHPI students?
Yeah, it's certainly so. So at a lot of these AANAPISIs, they are be able to access some new federal resources, and from there design broad initiatives and programs on these individual campuses. And so one of those components often that we see is a whole dimension about either developing new classes or redesigning existing curriculum that incorporates in the histories, experiences, challenges, all the full gamut of lived experiences for AA and NHBI students in the curriculum, in new classes, in classes that they can revamp. We also see institutions using it to design a whole series of co-curricular programming activities. One thing that I think is really cool that UMass Boston did, for example, was they had students go and do college access work at their own high school that they went to, and work with high school students to as they were exploring their post secondary. Their post-secondary lives. We're working with them on their college applications. We're letting them know about college, right? And going out into the community, into their own communities, and doing this work, which I think is just so great. We know the benefits that arise when students are engaged in those ways, and in this case, they're going back to their communities, going back to their high schools, and working with students there doing college access work. So, and then of course, there's a whole other leg where schools are working with students in doing research, right? And this isn't just a thing that's happening at research institutions. These are happening at AANAPISIs that are community colleges. I mentioned the one that I worked at, the Anza College, had a whole robust research program for their students, where faculty were training undergraduates at that college on how to do research that was connected to the AAPI experience. They were presenting it at conferences. They were getting articles published. So it's really cool. It's a way to be able to provide the research co-curricular academic experiences in a really meaningful way that highlights and uplifts student experiences.
Absolutely. Some of the similar things we see happening at HSIs,
Yeah,
right? Like
not
just
so again, I think that's why the two are so similar, right? In many
mhm,
dimensions. I will say because HSIs, I'm sorry, AANAPISIs were established by Congress much later than AANAPISIs. A lot of this work is happening is because folks who are working in the space have been reading really important
mm,
HSI literature, right? Your
mhm,
own work to inform their thinking about what to do with AANAPISIs. And so we
mhm.
are, I think folks in the AANAPISI community are immensely thankful for the HSI community because they essentially, the work that you and others have done, have written about, have published, was the basis for us to begin to think about what we need to be doing on campus in ways to serve our population. Just at a personal aside, I think I mentioned this to you years ago, but like even my own dissertation was based. I used as a graduate student, my advisor, Mitch Chang, was saying, did you find a dissertation that you can really base yours off, that can really inspire you? And if you once you find that, doing your own dissertation will be so much easier. And I told him, Mitch, I found one. It's Gina's, and he instantly said, you're gonna be in great shape. You're gonna be just fine. So, so yeah, even
Yes.
my own work, right, is because of your work and the work of HSI scholars who've really opened up a lot of doors for us to begin to think about how we can serve Asian American and Pacific Islander students. So much of it is because of the similarities between these two types of designations, right?
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Oh, we're so connected. Mitch was on my dissertation committee, obviously, so he knew that dissertation very well. And I tell my students that too. I'm like, find a dissertation that you're like, I love this. I want to write this dissertation. Because it's true, right? We have to have some sort of motivation. So
Yeah,
happy to know that mine was one of those for you.
motivation and inspiration, absolutely.
Yes, I love it. So let's build on that because I
Yeah.
think there's a lot to be said. So from my perspective as an HSI scholar, the servingness framework can be used by AANAPISI since the focus is very much on the S, right? The serving and the structural transformation. And also indicators, right? The indicators of serving are important, but really there's a lot of focus on the structural transformation within the servingness. So what are your thoughts on this? And what ways do you think AANAPISIs unique from HSIs are unique from HSIs, but how can they still use the servingness framework?
That's a really great question, and I'll answer it by saying the servingness framework for HSIs overlaps directly with the way we are thinking about AANAPISIs. From my own personal experience, I am on a research project right now that is funded by NSF. Shout out to the National Science Foundation for supporting our research project. That's a research practice partnership with one AANAPISI, and the way that in our proposal and the way we are operationalizing this research project, the servingness framework is the framework we are using for this study because all of the indicators, all of the dimensions of that framework map on in such similar, if not exactly precisely the same ways. And so for us, it allows us to begin to ask the right questions that are happening on these campuses, that are happening at AANAPISIs. Asking the right questions gives us the lens to be able to interpret what we're seeing and to see if these transformational practices are happening, and also how can we work with institutions to develop processes to get towards these get towards these objectives, right? And so I'm certainly I don't know if I'm the first, but I'm one of the people who are directly using that framework in AANAPISI research right now.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think it makes sense to use it in the sort of, structural ways. I think at the same time I the one thing I struggle with because I in the servingness framework and in a lot of my work, I still make sure I say, but we center Latinx students, right? Like we center those students, which is complicated because then people want to know, but what about all the other students? But I talk about, but still centering, right? Their ways of knowing, cultural ways of knowing. I mean, we talk about language, right? With HSI, like Spanish is a huge conversation in HSI world. So, what are your thoughts on that? Like making sure we still continue, right, to center the students we're trying to serve, which are the largest population often on the campus, and the reason we have the designation.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, I think at heart, that's how the servantist framework applies so well, and it fits so precisely. But certainly, of course, there's going to be cultural and racialized differences, right? Our students are going to have very different, in some cases, very similar racialized experiences, and then in many cases, very different types of racialized experiences as well. All that connected to their own families' histories, their own histories as people of color in the United States, and so I think that the difference there is coming in with a good understanding of what of the really diverse and complex and very beautiful Asian American differences in the experiences of Asian Americans and Pacific Islander students, and knowing that, right, and knowing what some of those nuances are going to be in applying that framework. So I think for us, language is going to be thought about a little bit differently, just given that there's such ethnic diversity and people are going to speak different languages, but then at the same time there's some cultural similarities that can be applied, and so it's having that level of sensitivity when adapting the framework, I think, is what is really key and really necessary. but broadly speaking, all of those dimensions are the specific channels in which, for this particular research project, we are using all of those particular approaches in order for us to begin to ask the right questions and think about the right types of practices. So, in that sense, I think it is a perfect. It fits the contours perfectly.
Mhm. Yes. Ooh, I like the idea of cultural sensitivity when applying the framework. That makes sense, right? Because like, yeah, you still want to think about the students who
That's
are
right.
most the ones that need the most love and attention in the
Yeah.
institution, right?
But
I
I guess the just thinking about some of the way you've written about it and so many others, right, is that students, Latinx students, Latin students at different HSIs in different parts of the country are going to have very different
Mhm,
cultural experiences too, right? So schools
mhm,
in Miami might have very different HSIs in the Miami area are going to have very different than in LA or in Texas, and so I think the framework is thoughtful and flexible in that it can be adapted to those different types of HSI environments, and I think that mirrors the AANAPISI experience in very similar
mhm.
ways.
Yeah, absolutely. But with that, I will say we have so much more work to do in
Absolutely.
complicating the H.
Yeah,
The H, so that's how I say it, right? We have to complicate the H. I'm like, well, first, the H is not a race, so that makes it complicated because now
yeah,
we have to talk
yeah,
about race across the H, right? So Afro Latini, that is very different than white presenting or white Latinos, right? Like that's a very different experience, or indigenous Latinos and
mhm,
Spanish speaking versus non-Spanish speaking. And if you live in Miami versus New York versus California, entirely different experiences, right? So it's like all of that, right? We need to complicate the H.
yeah,
And I assume the same, right, situation. Like, yeah, those
absolutely, yeah,
very different experiences, regional, right? Regional and ethnic experiences that could be
yeah.
happening at an Anapisi. Oh, so much more work to, and when I say things like that, I'm like, we got work to do. We gotta go back into the lab, the research lab. So much more to do. Well, let's talk about dual designation.
Yeah, yeah,
This was the motivation for this episode because people ask me about dual designation, and I just feel like I don't always have enough information, even though I feel like I do, but just not enough because it's a complicated, I think, conversation.
yeah.
So let's just talk from the federal perspective. Can an institution be both designated as an HSI and a PZ, and can institutions get both Title V and Title III grants?
Yeah, the such a complex question and such a messy answer, which is gonna be
Mm-hmm.
yes and also no, right? And so from a federal policy lens, it is actually really interesting and super super messy, really. And I think part of it is just because of the way all these designations were created, federally speaking, all this patchwork of legislation really sort of doesn't intersect well, and it creates all of these conundrums, right? But at the end of the day, again, so at the within Title III and Title V of the Higher Education Act, there are specific subcategories, parts, and within those parts are different types of designations. And so, for example, under Title III, there's an AANAPISI Part A and an AANAPISI Part F. In Title V, there's the HSI Part A, and then there's HSI STEM, which is Part F, right? And so, at the end of the day, an institution can access um, any number, any combination or number of funding from Part F, but can only access funding, one source of funding from Part A. So, in other words, if an institution has an AANAPISI Part A grant, then they are not eligible to access HSI Part A grant. But if an institution has an AANAPISI Part F grant, then that institution is then qualified to access funding from the HSI Part A. The conundrum, though, is Part A funding is like double or triple Part F funding, right? And we've seen that Part A Congress appropriate so much more money and over the last 3 or 4 years into Part A. We've seen that area skyrocket. Skyrocket for MSIs, but really still a drop in the bucket in the whole federal budget, right? And a drop in the bucket in the Department of Ed budget. but we've seen an increase in that, and so it's really complex because in some cases you can have funding under both, and in some cases and in many cases you cannot. But for the most part, given how much more funding there is available for Part A funds, um, most schools end up accessing those funds, and so it makes them ineligible to access other types of funding. Now, that's from a federal perspective. That doesn't mean then the school can't think about broad other mechanisms that they can use to support students and serve students, right? It isn't That's just the federal piece is just one piece out of many different things a school needs to be thinking about. But from a federal funding lens from the Department of Education, that designation issue really is impactful. I will say I said there's about 200-ish AANAPISis, um, uh, um, and of the schools that can be both an HSI, that are eligible to be both an HSI and an AANAPISI, there's about 90 of them. So if you think about it, that's about half of all AANAPISis, which actually makes sense, right? You go to these college campuses, you're going to see how diverse the student population is, and so that's nearly half. And you were saying about there's about 500 HSIs, so there's about 90-ish schools that can meet both designations, and that's about almost 20%, right, of all HSIs. Almost 1 in 5. That's a good solid. That's a lot of schools, and so this statutory limitation that prevents schools from accessing funding from both I think is problematic. About 7-ish years ago, a bipartisan group of members of Congress on both the House and the Senate, two Democrats and two Republicans in the House, two Democrats and two Republicans in the Senate, introduced a bill to remove this barrier. They called it the MSI Fairness Act. I think that's what they called it. But since then, we haven't seen a whole lot of legislation or movement in order to break down this structural statutory barrier, right? But I guess from my perspective, I think about it a lot because um, institutions are really diverse. In our home state of California, right, is where the bulk of these types of institutions are geographically located, and so I'm thinking about the ways that institutions there can access. It would be wonderful for them to be able to access all of these different resources to support all of their students, right? Now I live in New York City, and there's actually a campus here in New York, a school here called York College. This institution actually is eligible for 6 different funding from 6 different MSI designations, right?
Wow.
Some of which include, the HSIs, the AANAPISIs, and being a predominantly Black institution. And so they have to pick which one of those they're going to go for, right? So it's a hyper diverse institution, but they can only pick one. And so the hope is that this legislation gets picked up again, and there's some movement, and that way these institutions can be able to access resources to be able to support to have more resources to support their extremely diverse student populations.
Oh my gosh, that was the messiest answer ever.
I'm
I
sorry I don't have a
imagine
cleaner answer.
I imagined you going to like the board and like drawing out a flow chart for me.
I actually have
Okay.
I'm actually looking at a slide right now of it that I made just so I can like help me visualize. I can send it to you if you want to look at it.
Oh my gosh, my brain hurts.
Yeah.
So I'm not even going to get into the sixth designation. So I have 10% AANHPI students and I have 25% Hispanic Latina students. I can apply just for the general application, not the grants, just the designation for both. Yes or no?
Yes, yes, yes,
Yes.
yes, yes.
Okay,
In fact, it's
I
the
can
same. It's the same. I mean, if this is the eligibility,
just the eligibility.
yeah,
Hmm.
it's the same. It's the same In fact, it's one application, right? And it's the
Yeah.
same across all the board. You don't even need to indicate which of those designations you're even going for, right? But it's the same. It's essentially one for all of them, and
Yeah.
based off your enrollment, undergraduate enrollment numbers, then you'll see if you meet all the requirements to be these different types of HSIs and AANAPISIs and other MSIs. Here's the really interesting kicker: the federal government uses different enrollment variables for
Mm,
HSIs and
mm.
AANAPISIs. So if you go into iPads,
Say more.
yeah, if you go on iPads, iPads collects like 4 or 5 different enrollment variables, right? Depending on how if you want to count them in the fall, if you want to count FTE, if you want to count, and so they actually use two like the enrollment variable used to calculate 25% versus 10% for AANAPISIs. They use different variables. I found this out one day just playing with the data, and so there's a lot. Again, that adds to the patchwork of when all of these designations were created over different periods of time, right? And so there continues to be a lot of messiness overall, and so it's such a it's such a complex thing, and it makes sense why a lot of us still don't have our heads wrapped around dual designation, or in some cases meeting multiple designations, right? I think that's what makes it messy. But the important part is the other interesting thing is if you do meet multiple requirements, it's important to have that eligibility application in because during the peak of the pandemic when we had those 3 COVID stimulus bills, the more designations that you qualified for, the more federal funding you got, right? So all of that, if again from a federal lens, if we're talking about federal funding, all of that matters tremendously, right? Matters tremendously.
Okay. So one thing you didn't mention in there is that is also part of the eligibility, right, application is the income part.
Yeah,
Like the student income, right? Like the Pell eligible, which is also super complicated and super messy, right? Because there's different kinds of grants that fall under quote unquote needy, right? The federal government says needy.
yeah,
That's what they say, right? We
yeah,
all say low income, they say
yep,
needy. What about that? Is that the same for the two types of
yeah.
institutions?
Yeah,
Same
great. Yeah,
threshold?
I love that we're getting the technical federalese weeds
Mm-hmm.
of this. Like my favorite stuff to talk about. But you're absolutely
Yes.
right. It's the same. So this is all detailed out in Section 312B of the Higher Education Act, and within that, and there's a bunch of different requirements in there, right? But the main one is the low income students, or as the federal government calls it, needy students. It's the same exact metric for that, as well as the average general expenditure of the institution, right?
Mm,
Those two finance requirements, and so again, it's that one application for any institution, and so it yeah, it's just that one, and it's exactly the same
okay.
one. So if a school wants, if a school would just need to submit that, and then from there they had their 25% and a 10%, then they would be both, right? They, in the eyes of the federal government, they would be eligible for both.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. Now then you brought in something else I hadn't even brought in, which was the institutional resources, right? Which is also part of the application.
yeah,
Um, now is this what makes like a, let's say a Harvard? A Harvard is technically over the 10%, right? Of the AANHPI
yeah,
students.
yeah.
Is is a Harvard eligible for ANAPISI, or does that a reason why they maybe are not?
Yeah, technically, that's it. They would not,
Okay.
because they don't meet the average general expenditure of a private 4-year institution, right? But of course, there's a whole mechanism for a waiver, right? There's a whole waiver process that institutions can file a waiver for, and if they can make an argument for why they should waive out of that requirement, and it gets accepted, then it can, right? Part of this is in the statute. There's actually a line in there that says. Um, these are the requirements to be the federal requirements to be an MSI. However, as well as the Secretary of Education can make a determination also. So essentially, what they're saying is the Secretary of Education can waive schools into that status, and so this is the formal mechanism in which schools can file for a waiver application to waive out if they don't meet those requirements. And to a certain extent, sometimes it makes sense, right? If you think about in some institutions, like even here in New York City, where the cost of living is exceptionally high, and because of that, the expenditures are going to be larger at some schools in New York than in what is the national average, right? And so I think that was actually a really wonderful thing that can be used if used in meaningful ways to address sort of big broad regional differences, because certainly there's a lot of low income students at some schools here in New York, but because it's just so expensive to live here, the university is going to have potentially higher expenditures. So it's good to have a little bit of flexibility, I think.
Thank you for going down this path with me into the details of the the designation. By the way, I just want to let everybody that's listening know I am not advocating that Harvard should be an AANAPISI
Neither am
or
I.
an HSI, okay? Because they got too much money to be because we have to acknowledge that the history of this is to support the institution, right? That the institutions are typically under resourced to serve this population that needs resources.
That's right.
That's not a Harvard doesn't fit that, right? Which is why I'm glad you brought into that third dimension, which
Yeah.
is often not talked about.
Yeah.
You know, we focus so much on the percentage of enrollment and not talk about the next two dimensions. So yes, I'm not advocating, just putting that on record right now for Harvard to be an HSI or an NFPC ever, ever. So as I mentioned, as we were getting ready for the episode, a college president actually
Yeah.
requested this episode. So what, in thinking about college presidents that are trying to figure out HSI and NAPZ, and now some of them are trying to figure out both, right? 90 some institutions trying to figure out both at the same time. What are your thoughts? And I think this leans to your, leaning back into when you got into this, you said, here's the federal stuff, but here's at the core, right? If there was no federal, you're still serving these populations, right? What are your suggestions for college presidents listening on how to manage this dual designation?
Yeah, I think part of it, right, is at the end of the day, even if you were able, if we even if we were to sort of access all of the MSI funding from Title III, Title V, at the end of the day, it's still not giant buckets of money. Certainly it's resources, it's additional resources. It is welcomed and it can do a lot of really great work. But also, an AANAPISI, if you were to get an AANAPISI Part A grant, it's a 5-year grant and it's about $350,000 every year, right? That can do a lot of really wonderful work, but it also isn't the biggest part of the budget of the university, right, or the college. And so I think what it does, and so end of the day, it's not just about the federal resources, right? It's got, if you're a college leader, the resources are wonderful and you can use it to do so many great things, um, but if you just rely on, I think, only that, you're not going to be able to have these larger transformative impacts that I think students really really need, right? And so yes, if your school is both an HSI is and an ANAPISI, and you can only access funding for one, it doesn't mean that you just ignore all the other students who might need support and resources and to feel like they can be their full selves on campus, right? And so and so, yes, it's wonderful to have the federal designation, but at the same time, you can also invest resources and support students in doing this work. I think I think to me that's the. I think back to when I was doing my own dissertation and I was interviewing this one faculty member, and he said, we were doing this work before ANAPISI, we'll be doing this work after ANAPISI. We're always going to be doing this work, right? Regardless if we get the money or we don't get the money. And I think that's sort of the type of thinking that I hope people will adopt. Now, knowing that realistically, budgets are constrained, resources are always tight, and so I think the other thing that presidents can do and think about is begin to advocate to get this structural limitation addressed, right? Get this statute the statute amended, and the good part is there was a bipartisan bill introduced some time ago, and it just needs to be reintroduced. And presidents are the ones who are going to have the ability to be able to push legislators to understand this problem and address it legislatively. I think those avenues both of those need to happen at the same time.
Yes. Oh, thank you for bringing that in. That comes into the more into the transforming HSI's framework, where I talk
Mm,
about HSIs needing to engage with the federal government. That if you
yeah,
want to really advance servingness, we're gonna have to keep pushing on the federal government to think about these things and advocating, right, and having our voices heard, to know that this is a concern particularly when we think about the dual designation, and the concern that happens at the student level. Because
Yeah,
I've heard about multiple campuses that the students feel like you're now picking, right? Like, oh, well, Hispanic, Latinx, Latina students are more important than your AAPI students, or vice versa, right? And that's just not the case, right? Because of all these like past 10, 15 minutes, you've really given us this complexity, but students don't see it that way. They see you picked one group over the other,
that's
right?
right.
And
That's right.
that's hard. That's really
Y-
hard for
y-
people.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and then again, that one institution in here in New York, they have to pick between black students, in terms of federal funding, right? Black students, Latin students, Asian American Pacific Islander students, and so that's an immense challenge. And yeah, from a student perspective, they might just be like you're picking one over the other, and I don't think I don't think any student needs to be feeling that way at all. And so I think yeah, it's incumbent on all of us in the higher education space to address those issues on campus, but as well as advocate and push for our policymakers to get rid of this structural barrier that is forcing us to pick one or the other, right?
Mhm.
That's just really unfortunate.
It is. Yep. But at the end of the day, me and you are on the same page where we're like, if I've said even like, let's say the federal dollars went away. Let's say we didn't even have federal dollars. You're still enrolling the same percentages of students, racially, ethnically minoritized students. So you're still serving, right? You're still going to have to serve this population with or without the dollars. The dollars help. We need the dollars. We absolutely need to advocate for more dollars. But at the end of the day, yeah, you still got to do this work. These are still the students that are
Absolutely.
coming.
Yeah.
Like,
No, yep, yep, and you can have all the dollars in the world, but if you're not invested in actually serving and supporting those students, the dollars that will mean are meaningless too, right? So you need to
mhm,
have that servingness approach
mhm.
in doing the work. Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's the fun part of doing all this work is like HSI, if those of us done weren't advocating it for it to be something more than the federal dollars, it would just be the federal dollars.
that's right,
Right. But there's
that's right.
enough of us that are like, no, it has to be more. It has to be meaningful. It has to be intentional for the students and the faculty and staff. You brought in that too, right? That faculty and staff are being served in important ways through the designations as well.
Yeah,
It means something more to us, right?
absolutely. Yep.
Than those dollars.
Yeah, but the
So
good thing about the dollars is it allows us to be able to, if the work hasn't already started, it allows us to begin to start that work, that very important extensive work,
mhm.
right? Or we've started that work, it allows us to give more resources to be able to keep advancing that work. And so yeah, all of it's important, everything has its role to play.
Yes, exactly. Woo, I love this. This is so fun and nerdy. This is good stuff. These are kind of good conversations, and I hope people are really sitting and taking notes. I'm going to listen and retake notes. So thank you for digging into dual designation. It's such an important conversation. I think we need
Yeah,
to keep bringing it up. And I knew you were the right person to bring onto the pod to talk about it. So let's talk about one of your projects, the
yeah,
MSI Data Project, which is an initiative with the mission to advance a greater understanding of MSIs and their unique contributions to post-secondary education. So first, can you tell us about the 11 different types of MSIs, which all come into your project, and including the difference between mission-based and enrollment-based, which you mentioned a little bit. I think you
yeah.
told us enrollment-based, but you didn't tell us mission-based. So if you could talk to us about that.
Yeah, and so let me preface by saying this project is really built off all of the other amazing MSI scholars that have been doing such important work. Our the goal here, the way we were inspired was a way to sort of begin to bring all of these different types of scholarship into conversation with each other, right? As well as bring in a federal lens and a federal perspective. And so I say that because I spent 6.5 years working as a congressional staffer and living in policy land and doing work with the AANAPISIs from that perspective. And so often, of course, much of that also means that it's tied to federal funding, right? And so from as a way to sort of think about MSIs from that perspective, right? And if you were to pull up the federal statute and look there and look at, say, the federal budget, you would see that there's actually 11 different designations that are MSI designations that each have their own, essentially are appropriated their own individual account of funding from Congress. And it gets even more complicated because if you include the Serving Institutions program, SIP, that makes it 12. And then, of course, Howard University gets its funding independently of the HBCU designation, gets its own line item in the federal budget. So that, so it just layers and layers of complexity, right? But at the end of the day, there are 11 different MSI-based designations that the federal government appropriates dollars to on an individual designation basis, right? And so we wanted to make sure that that was highlighted because some schools qualify for some and not others, right? And so really as a way to sort of advance that understanding of the complexity of MSIs. And then the other sort of reason why we started doing this project was all that you probably get this all the time too, right? Is people go, hey, how many schools are there? How many students are they enrolling? How many students are earning credentials at these institutions? Really general, basic questions. And every single time I got a question like that, I'd be like, well, let me crunch some numbers and get back to you. And I figured, there's got to be an easier way to do this. Let me use it to build a data set that we can just put up on the website, a website, and people can just go and pull the data themselves. And so we did that. We use these 11 different designations and merged all this data together, and then built a bunch of Tableau dashboards, really through collaboration with some other wonderful folks, Sophia Latterman, Kelsey Heckert, Joe Ramirez, did all this work and made these dashboards. So you can go there and click on a state and see how many MSIs are in that particular state, how many students they're enrolling, how many are earning college degrees. Some really general stuff. And that was sort of the impetus, right? It was to be able to support other researchers, other faculty and staff, and then of course policymakers who were often the ones asking me these questions. And so it was a way to sort of support them, and it evolved from there. So now we have this 5-year data set that other researchers can download and merge in and study whatever phenomena they want to study. And so I think it's a real fun tool, right? If you have if you want to get a better sense of campus climate at predominantly Black institutions across the country over our longitudinal time of 2017 to 2021, you can download the data set and merge it in with your own data collection that you're doing and run your analyses, right? So that was sort of the goal there, was to be able to support people like the people listening to this podcast, other researchers, to be able to investigate phenomena that they're interested in, but also have it focus on different types or all types of MSIs.
Okay. So you would say that the audience, the core audience is researchers, like the core audience for the dashboard, or do you think it's accessible to, like, let's say practitioners? Like how could they use it as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think also for I would say mainly researchers and policymakers. I think for practitioners, I've once we launched it, we were getting a lot of meetings with different practitioners, and
Hmm.
they were asking questions about it and how could they use it. And so I think our next step is to, one, secure more funding to support this project, and then two, once we have it, to be able to add in more data that other other practitioners are hoping to have in there,
Hmm.
right? So this is just sort of phase one, and so we hope to build more tools in phase two, as well as add more years on the front end and on the back end of the data set. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm excited about the project. I know when it first came into my email box, it was a chronic person from the Chronicle asking me to comment on it, which
Oh yeah.
I was overwhelmed with my transition. So I was like, no, leave me alone. But then later, 2, 3 months later, I was like, what is this MSI data project? So so happy to see that you were working on that. But it's fun how we sometimes find out about these things. They wanted me to comment on something I didn't know anything about. So I was like,
Oh yeah.
no, I don't know anything about it right now. And my brain hurts.
Well, first off, it makes sense that they reach out to you for a lot of different reasons, given your areas of expertise, but also because in the article that we wrote, in the educational researcher, to help essentially build the typology for us to build the data set, we cite your work, and we basically say that because within the servingness framework, there are ways to be able. There are different indicators that you can measure, right? And so
Hmm.
part of this utility of this thing is of this project is that we can then use it to be able to measure some of those indicators across time and across different types of MSIs, right? And so maybe they saw
Mm.
the citation in the article and were like, okay, let's give Gina a call and see if we can get her thoughts on this project.
I was like, "Leave me alone." I feel bad. Now that I'm thinking about it, I was like, I should go back to that person. I was like, I cannot think about this right now. But I think the project's amazing. So let me just put it on record here. And so good for us, particularly as scholars, right? That
Yeah.
really need this data dashboard. But it does. It's anyone listening, please visit the website. It is linked in the show notes, and learn about the MSI Data Project. So another thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit more, dig into your knowledge of like the inner workings of the federal government, because one of the things I talk about in my newest book, the Transforming HSIs, which I mentioned already, is like we have to engage with federal government, we have to engage with state. We need to start thinking about how states can support a construct that is at the federal level, right? Doesn't mean states can't support it. So talk to us about that. What advice do you have for building relationships with either state and or federal policymakers as a way to support HSI and MSI work?
Yeah, what a great question, and so awesome that that's such an important aspect of your new book, which I think everyone should go by and read. I'll answer this question from my perspective as a former congressional staffer, right? So when I was working for a member of Congress, I loved it when we got invitations to go to different college campuses that were MSIs and learn about the important work that was happening. I recognize that that's a lot of work on the campus's end to be able to set those meetings up, to go through all the hoops internally, to ask and invite folks to come. But when that does happen, when that level of engagement does happen, policymakers, their staff are super excited to come and learn about all the important work. Remember, much of this is funded through the federal government, so it's important for them to get a sense of what actually the transformative work that's happening on a college campus. To know that those federal dollars are being used in a way that's making such huge improvements in all sorts of experiences for students, not just completion rates and stuff like that, but the ways that students feel about themselves, the way they see themselves, the way they use that to work and serve their own communities. That is just so powerful, and I know firsthand from my own experiences that when we get invited to visit campuses that way, there's always a lot of excitement and it's always a whole lot of fun to learn from that. So I think that's one way that you can folks should begin to outreach and engage, right? And that's just the first step that begins to build these broader relationships that can then what we then can use to be able to advocate for addressing things like the multiple designation issue, the dual designation issue, as well as advocate for increased funding, right? Increased funding for to so that way more MSIs can have access to funds, or each MSI can have more than just the $350,000 a year that I was mentioning, right? So all of those things, and then but and that again doesn't have to happen just at the federal level. It can certainly happen at the state level too. And in California, there's been some success in the AANAPISI space with having a state support of AANAPISIs at the CSU and community college level. And so I think that's a really interesting approach and sort of legislative phenomena, budgetary phenomena that happen in California that I think other communities in other states can think about figuring out how to do something similar, where the state is investing in AANAPISIs in California. And so I think that can happen for other MSI designations in other parts of the country. The state, just because it's a federal construct doesn't mean that state local governments can't be invested in the same way. And of course, they can use their own definition if they want, right? They don't have to use the federal definition either. But the important part is beginning to sort of think externally and working with in collaboration with some of these with other stakeholders, policymakers, they will be excited to come to campus and to learn, and it's such a wonderful opportunity for them to see what's going on. I should also say that's not going to work well in every state, right? There's places that some of this work uh, might not play well. You might have an elected official who this is not an issue they care about, and so there it's important to work in coalition with other MSIs, HSIs, AANAPISIs across the country, and work on that at maybe the state level or at the national level, right? And so just recognizing the complexity of the of political engagement.
Yes. Ooh, thank you for saying that because that is complicated. Like when I
Yeah,
visit some states, Texas, I'm like, I'm sorry, you're in Texas. But you have to be real about what's going on at the state level, right? Of like, you still have to do this work and it still has to happen, but we also have to understand the complexities of what's
yeah,
going on at the state level, right? Which changes, right?
yeah.
That's why we got to get out there and vote so we can change it if we're not happy with it. But that's the reality is some states are more supportive of some of
That's
these
right. That's right. But but at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that you can't work with an association.
mm-hmm.
Also, right, we have associations that advocate on all of our collective behalves. That can push for more resources, more funding. So there's just a lot of different ways to engage, and it doesn't have to just be with your member of Congress, right? It could
Mm-hmm.
be
Mm.
there's sort of a lot of different ways, and yeah, but I think that's important. And wholesale, I think when elected officials and their staff get invited to campus, they like to come and they like to learn, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
to see what's happening. So at least that was my own personal individual experience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for saying that and
Yeah,
for validating some of the own work I'm doing with some colleagues here in California because we're in that place of like we've got to start reaching out, right? They don't know what we're doing if we don't reach out to them. But to hear you say they'll be excited and they're going to want to learn about the work is also really cool,
yeah.
right?
I mean, if you think about it, a lot of their staff are former students, right?
Mm,
Who maybe have recently just graduated, and so so another angle to think about, right? And so they're going to be really excited to come back to their institutions or similar institutions to get a sense of what of that work. And yeah, it's a nice full circle when I think about it that way.
yeah. Oh, I love that. That's also in the book, alumni engagement, because our
Yeah.
alumni go
Yes,
back out and they're yeah, they're
that's right.
they're legislators, they're all the things, right? And like we got to be good to them when they're here because they're going to give back when they're
Yeah.
back out there.
Yeah.
So, absolutely. The other piece that I talk about in that chapter, that final chapter of the book, is about engaging with like donors and private funders. And the reason I talk about that is because I don't think we can rely on the federal dollars, right? The federal dollars, as you mentioned, have increased exponentially, but not really, right? Like when we think about the number, right? And you've given us a good overview of the number of institutions that really could use these dollars to help advance some of their servingness work. So I talk about that. Well, maybe you need to, also work with other outside funders who would also probably be excited about your project. So, what are your thoughts on that and or recommendations? Because I know you've had some successes there as
No, I
well.
I totally I could not agree more, right? Engaging with all sorts of folks from individual donors who may be alumni to other foundations who are invested in this work. You know, given the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, I think a lot of our field is thinking about, well, what do we do now, right? What do we do now to address so many of these issues now that we lost this tool? And more often than not, the conversation keeps returning to, well, what are MSIs doing? What are they doing to support their students? I think the work that they're doing is what we need to be doing. And so I think more people from foundations and other external entities are beginning, maybe drawing their attention to the MSI space to learn from the MSI community. So I would say it's sort of the same thing with policymakers. Is this is an opportunity to invite them in so they can get a better sense of what's been happening, right? All this attention has been on Harvard and UNC, and certainly all that's really important, but so many more students of color are going to MSIs, right? I think in the first line of that article for our MSI Data Project, we say that really MSIs are the backbone of post-secondary education for students of color. They are enrolling large numbers of students of color, and so bringing the focus and attention into what these institutions are doing, what they've been doing all along, I think is so important.
Ooh, right there. I like retweet that because we don't advocate enough, right? Like, yeah, why aren't the HSI and the PZ MSI stories at the top of Chronicle of Higher Education every day, right? Because they're
Yeah,
such
yeah,
beautiful stories, and we're just not doing a very good job of maybe telling them and reaching out. So, yes, absolutely. Okay, so final question of the podcast is for some reason the hardest question for everybody.
it is.
It's a hard one, right? But really, the title of the podcast is "¿Qué pasa, HSIs? What's up, HSIs?" So, how do you respond to that?
Well, it is the hardest question. Um, I'll try to say it in sort of two things, which is one is what I said earlier, which is I think the AANAPISI community is so grateful for the HSI community because what's up? Well, we've been learning everything that we're doing from all the important work that the HSI community has been doing for all of this time. So one, I think that's what's up, and then two is part of the theme and topic of this conversation is I think. Um, we're sort of in a really exciting stage and phase of the MSI conversation, the way it's evolved to now we're talking about schools that meet more than one designation, and so what does that mean, and how do we begin to think about serving all the different students in all the different ways, and being able to tear down some of these federal structures that inhibit that work, and so how do we build structures to promote that more of that work? I think is where we are now, and it's such an exciting time to be in conversation with you and with others in thinking about this work.
Awesome. And that's what's up. Thanks for visiting us today on the podcast, Mike. It was such a pleasure to have you.
It was so fun. Thank you so much for having me, and what a joy and what a pleasure.